can probably get started here. I just want to welcome everybody, and my name is Beth, and I'm the graduate assistant for the MPA program. And just to let everyone know, if you could mute your mics, that would be great. And this will be recorded, so if you want to reference this later, we'll be uploading it to the Whitburn Center YouTube channel. And also, if you want to hold questions till the end, that would be great. But of course, feel free to put them in the chat as you think of them if you'd like to do it that way as well. But we'll have Dr. Ford answer the questions toward the end of the event. And so I will hand it off to Dr. Larson.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us here over the lunch hour. Feel free to keep your cameras off for now if you're filling in or fitting in lunch while listening and joining us today. I'm Sam Larson. I'm Deputy Director of the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research. And thank you again for joining us. It's our first event of the year, so thank you for helping us kick that off. I just want to take a moment before handing things over to Michael Ford to just introduce the Whitburn Center to folks if you're not familiar with it. We are about to celebrate our 1-year anniversary or birthday as a research center here at UW Oshkosh. We just launched the center back in the fall of 2021. And our mission, broadly speaking, is to conduct nonpartisan, practical applied research that focuses on evaluating and improving governance and professional management and policy in Wisconsin and beyond Wisconsin as well. And then in terms of kind of our vision, what we really want to focus on is, building local government, nonprofit, and community capacity to promote the common good, but also address really complex challenges that folks are facing out in the field. Like all of you who are joining us today, probably have some experience with the issues that we're presenting on today. And part of the way that we're doing that is conducting research, hosting events, and working with our Master of Public Administration alumni and other students on projects that are, addressing kind of their emerging needs as they see it as they go through the program and even beyond the program. So I just want to provide a quick link in the chat for you all if you want to learn more about the Whitburn Center. So just typing that over here now. Today, I am excited to introduce you to the director of the Whitburn Center, Dr. Michael Ford, who will be presenting a practical approach to improving governing board performance or governing for results in Wisconsin. So this is related to a report that he has been preparing along with other staff here at the Whitburn Center over the last several months. Dr. Ford also serves as an associate professor of public administration, and he's chair of the MPA program here at UW Oshkosh. I have to, again, just throw over in the chat here, if you want to learn more about our MPA program, there's a link for it if you're interested. Mike has over 50 peer-reviewed publications related to issues of board governance and education policy. And so, quite a bit of expertise that he'll be sharing with us today. He sits on multiple public and nonprofit governing boards, including the Oshkosh Common Council. And before coming to UW Oshkosh, he has held several positions in the nonprofit sector. So thrilled to have Mike Ford kicking off our Whitburn Wednesday series with us today. And Mike, I will hand it on over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all for that introduction, and thank you for coming. This is our, as Dr. Larson said, our second year of the Whitburn Center and the second year of having these Whitburn Wednesday events. And got a shout out to Sam Larson, Renee Christensen, and Beth Boucher, who have done a great job putting these events together. My only critique is that for the kickoff for year 2, you think you'd get a better speaker, but alas, you have me. So as Dr. Larson said, the point here is to share with you some details and background of a new report that we are releasing shortly related to improving the performance of governing boards here in Wisconsin. And I want to give you, I just muted myself there because I'm very technologically inept, apparently. I want to give you a little bit of background before we get going about how I got into this. So I after my undergraduate, I was working in the nonprofit sector, and I was doing some lobbying and spending a lot of time in Madison and going to various committee meetings, et cetera. And in my college career, I spent so much time studying political science and studying structures and policies, and that stuff certainly is important. But I was just struck by, at the end of the day, it's a group of people making a decision. Like, if you boil down the governance process to its simplest form, it's a group of 3 people, 5 people, 7 people getting together, trying to make a decision. And it bothered me that we seem to discount the human side of governance when in the academic field, when the practical side of it was all about the human condition and all the good, bad, and ugly that comes along with it. And like many a grad student, I was writing these ideas down thinking I had invented them. I did not invent them. There was like a 50-year history of literature and public administration dealing with these issues of the human side of governance. And I really embraced that. And I ended up doing my dissertation on school board governance, trying to explore the question of basically, do school boards matter, or can they matter? And then increasingly, as my career went on, I got involved in city government and serving on many boards. So very much a client of these things. And so I try to be as practical as possible and share a combination of things that have existed in the academic literature, but also things that are a really practical use. So my hope here is that you can all leave with something you can take away, bring back to your governing board, your workplace, and hopefully find useful. So as was said, I'm an associate professor of public administration, also the director of the Whitburn Center here at UWO. I mentioned I'm also a client of many a governing board. I've been on the Common Council. I think my wife just entered the chat, so I got to be really nice here. I can't make any off-color jokes about my family. Not that I would ever do that. But I'm also a client, so I've served on the Oshkosh Common Council for 3 years, which has been a great experience. I've also served obviously as an elected official, which is very different than some of my service on the Oshkosh Plan Commission Committee on Aging and Long Range Finance, because those are appointed positions as a citizen. I also serve on the Clarity Care Board here in Oshkosh, which is a nonprofit home health care organization. So very different type of board. Then I'm also on a state advisory board I was appointed to, looking at transparency in the reporting of education data. And I share this all not just because I'm lucky to be an academic and have the time to do this stuff as part of my day job, but these are all different boards that I come to serve on in different ways. But it strikes me that the commonality is, again, all of them is a group of people getting together, trying to make the best decisions possible, oftentimes under difficult circumstances. That's a little bit about my background, how I got into this. So some background here on the actual issue at hand. So here at the Whitburn Center, we focus on local government in particular, because we think it's the level of government most likely to impact Wisconsin residents' day-to-day lives. Right, I can see what's going on in DC, and I can get mad about the Senate or whatever, but as I'm actually driving to work, I'm using city roads. I'm using city water when I get home, right? The day-to-day problems tend to be local government problems. It's also the place where I think residents can be most impactful in contacting their elected officials. And all of these local government entities in Wisconsin, they're overseen by a democratically elected governing board. And it brings the question to mind, what do these folks actually do? And the answer I've always gotten is, oh, they govern, it's governance. I'm like, well, that's good. But what does governance actually mean? There's a level of ambiguity to it. And I'll go through some of these definitions of government, but you'll notice what I'm trying to, or of governance, excuse me, but you'll notice what we're trying to do in this report is really boil it down to its simplest form, which is a group of people interacting with one another, trying to make a decision together. So give you an idea, Wisconsin's a great place to do research on this. I do think some of the lessons that we're going to share here with the group can be applied to any type of governing board, public, private, nonprofit, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in Wisconsin. But a lot of it is based on academic research that has been done right here in Wisconsin, because we are a fruitful state for having just a lot of governing boards, a lot of different contexts in which we can study this thing we call governance. And I'm not going to spend too much time with academic references, et cetera. If you really, really want to go down that rabbit hole, feel free to reach out to me and contact me, and I can send you some academic articles. But I do think it's worth pointing out that all of these suggestions we're going to give today and the governance toolkit that we're going to walk through today, it's all based on academic research that has been done on governing boards right here in Wisconsin. Okay, what is governance? My favorite cliche. If you've ever had a class with me, and I see we got a few former students on the line, you know that I like to always start off the class by saying resources are finite, needs are infinite, and values are contested. Your job as a governing official, whether you're an elected official or a staff member, is you have to operate in this environment. So basically, no matter what you do, you're never going to satisfy everybody's needs because those needs they're infinite. And by the way, whatever you do, half the people are going to disagree with you because we don't even agree on what success looks like. So I share that as the context for the governing environment because so much of what we're going to discuss, like conflict and cooperation, it's really baked into the structure of a democratic society. So an academic definition of governance based on a democratic governing context is that it can be understood as the structures, relationship rules, and people involved in public policies and implementing public goods and services. Wow, that's broad. That's not very useful for those of you doing the day-to-day work. So I'm going to search for a few other definitions here. One of my favorite academic scholars, James Farah, he did write the book about professional city management and the differences between governance and operations, which I'll talk about in a minute. But he defines governance as the way officials make policy decisions, implement them, manage resources, and ongoing operations. All right, I think that's a fair definition. It's kind of an old school definition, but it's useful. More recently, Peters and Pierre, which are kind of interesting. One of them's at the University of Pittsburgh. One of them's at a university in Europe. So they bring, again, very different perspectives to it. But the reason I like their approach to governance is that they recognize that increasingly governance involves the nonprofit sector. It involves the private sector. And I think that's important to point out because those organizations also have governing boards. So we can't really understand governance, and we certainly can't intervene in ways that improve governance if we don't take into account that we're dealing across sectors here in an increasingly ambiguous environment. And then there's Ford and Erkey. I don't know if you've heard of these people. This is my favorite definition for governance because I got to work with my PhD advisor and come up with it. But as you'll find out in a minute, we really tried to focus on perceptions. Our whole logic being, and this was grounded in research and grounded in experience, is that in a democratic governing context where human beings are making decisions, perceptions matter just as much as the reality, right? I'm looking at one of our employees here, Renee Christensen. Even if I think she's doing a great job, and I tell her that, but if she perceives that she thinks she's doing a bad job and she doesn't believe me, that's the reality we have to deal with in a professional environment. The perceptions matter just as much as the reality because we're dealing with human beings here. So that's a little bit of the context of how we come at these things here. Moving down the line, trying to understand what governance is and what it isn't. I think one of the problems we have when we discuss governance, and one of the reasons a lot of people tune out when they hear governance, say, no, I'm more of a policy person because governance is too ambiguous and too general. Well, I think that we shouldn't treat it as one single concept. It's multiple concepts. There's the macro level governance questions, right? What's the appropriate size of government? Who should be in charge of what? What should be done at the local level versus the state level? All those questions of federalism. Things that those of us working in local government, we have to deal with, we have to react to it. But at the end of the day, we don't have a lot of control over it. A lot of the things we do from the macro level is a function of what state regulators tell us we have to do. A lot of our funding decisions are bound by how much shared revenue is being sent from the state to local government. Bottom line, it's constricted. We can do things like lobby and try to change the macro level governance environment, but day to day, there's not a lot of control over it, which is why I'm drawn to micro level governance. So really the governance of individual organizations, because that is something I can control when I'm sitting on a governing board or if I'm managing an organization. That's a place where I actually have the ability to make changes. And what I think is so powerful about the work I'm going to share, that sounded really egotistical. Maybe it's not powerful. You can set me straight at the end. But the reason I'm drawn to it is it is all stuff that we can control. We can actually improve the performance of governing boards and the performance of organizations, because that's the ultimate goal, improve organizational outcomes by just improving the way we interact with one another, improving the culture of our governance boards. And we can measure a lot of this stuff, and we can intervene in ways that improve our governing behaviors. And that's really powerful when you're trying to navigate that difficult governing context where resources are finite, needs are infinite, values are contested, and there's so much that you can't control at the local level. The fact that there is something you can control and take proactive steps that will ultimately lead to improved organizational outcomes, I think is incredibly empowering and something we need to be talking about more. Hence why we did this report. So I just taught a class yesterday about data visualization, and you might see this data visualization and think, Mike, you're not the guy that should be teaching a class on data visualization. Luckily, we spent a lot of time talking about poor data visualizations. I shined in that part. But I share this because this is I think a nice way of answering the question I always get asked when I talk about governance, and it's the how. Right. So you're saying that if we just have a better culture on our governing board, the organization will do better? Well, how? And there's good research tying back to, there's a group of studies called the Lighthouse Studies that dealt with school boards in Iowa. But then there's a heck of a lot of work that Jerry Gabris, Doug Erkey, and then eventually myself, because I glommed onto their work, started doing in Illinois and Wisconsin in a municipal context that really demonstrates exactly how the group dynamics of a governing board can, if done right, translate to organizational outcomes. Think of it as a game of telephone, right? A game of telephone, you ever run around, right, sit around in a circle. Maybe you have more active social lives than I do, but I like games of telephone. You're all sitting in a circle. The first person has something that they have to say, and you get to the end and you try to see what comes out. It's usually funny because it's something that's dramatically different. Governing's a little bit like that. It's a game of telephone, trying to translate your organizational goals as determined by a governing board into practice. It's a hard thing to do, but it's something that can be sabotaged at that first level, that group dynamic on a governing board. And I share that because it is important to point out that all these tips and tricks that we're going to share today, none of this is a guarantee, but it creates a foundation where success is possible. It creates a foundation where organizational improvement isn't possible. And I think as trustees on a governing board, that's what you're trying to do from a high level. You're not involved in the day-to-day operations, but you can set the tone. So we'll talk about conflict, trust and ownership, and alignment in a governing context. But going back to these linkages, the idea is if we as a governing board can translate really clear advice to a city manager and do it in a way where we actually own those decisions, that city manager can feel empowered and really understand exactly the message they're trying to send to their department heads. Those department heads can actually implement the organizational goals. And then we can actually have quality feedback mechanisms because everybody's on the same page, and we have an organizational culture and a governing culture where people are responsive and take pride and ownership over their decisions. Again, it's no guarantee, but I would argue if you have a dysfunctional governing board, you're putting the executive and your department heads in a position where they're playing a game of telephone, but they're getting 7 or 8 mixed messages. So you play a game of telephone with one message, right? There's a lot of steps, but you might come out with the right message. But if you have 4 or 5 people giving you different messages, there's no way in heck you're going to come out with the one unifying message because you don't even agree on what that is. So let's talk about conflict. I love me some conflict. The good, bad, and the ugly. We should expect conflict in a governing environment. I mentioned I serve on the Oshkosh City Council. Oshkosh has 67,000 people. We have 7 elected officials that are elected at large. We should disagree on things. I was just emailing a constituent over lunch who was being clever. Like, I don't always agree with you, Mike, but I appreciate it. It was very nice. He was giving me a compliment. But my response was, well, if you agreed with me on everything, I would view you as suspect because of course I'm wrong about things, right? I'm one person, a human being trying to work on behalf of 67,000 people. Everybody else in that position is doing exactly the same thing. We shouldn't agree. And we should disagree with one another because conflict can be good. When you have productive conflict, that leads to more policy ideas being put out there, leads to better decisions. People feel like they've been heard. Sometimes people just need to blow off steam if they're mad about something, and having some conflict can be a really good thing. Can actually bring people closer together. But it can be problematic. Relationship conflict is the most obvious, when personal issues drive division between governing board members. Sometimes this can go back, and I've seen the gamut of this in some of my research with local government Wisconsin. Sometimes it's someone like, yeah, you know what, in high school, this city council member broke up with my buddy, so I don't like her. Okay, fair enough. There's all kinds of different reasons that people can have relationship conflict on a governing board, but it's inherently unproductive because you're fighting about things that are totally divorced from the goals of your organization. Task conflict is a little different. And this is where there's disagreement over what a board should be working on. This can be productive if done right, and if people are able to eventually come to agreement and have those processes where they can start to agree and actually move on. It becomes problematic when you never move on from the task conflict and you start having coalitions develop. Then we have our process conflict. And this is where we just disagree over how something should be done. Should it go through this committee? Should we have a public hearing about this? Should we have a workshop about this? And process conflict can be productive if it actually ends up in a resolution where you have a process developed, but it can also be a safe harbor. And what I mean by that is I've come across many governing boards where you have people that they're trying and they get along with one another, but they disagree about a process. So they talk about it. They have meetings and they never resolve it. And it becomes this safe harbor where it looks like productivity. It looks like work. Like, yep, we had 4 meetings and we're really hammering home what we're going to do here, but they're not actually doing anything. And they're never able to get to that next step because they want to avoid that more difficult task conflict. So they get mired in process conflict. And then we have the other side of the conflict question. And Bob Golumbewski, who is at the University of Georgia, he's passed away, but had done some incredible work about trust and ownership. And he calls it regenerative relations. But what he's really getting at is whether our day-to-day interactions on a governing board increase trust between one another or decrease trust between one another. And I'll show you a tool to measure this in a second. But the basic idea is like, can I take you at your word? When my colleague says something, do I know that they mean it? Do I feel comfortable speaking up? Because any of these things go wrong, we're not having an honest conversation. And in fact, each of our interactions are actually eroding trust. And eventually we're going to build our governing culture that's not conducive to openness, honesty, and success. And then there's the issue of alignment. This is another area where Doug Erke, who's at UW-Milwaukee, and I have done a lot of research. And some of this is my background in doing K-12 education work, where I get really frustrated about elected officials talking about the need for accountability, but nobody could define it. I went to the trouble of surveying 5,000 school board members across the United States to see how they defined accountability. And I think I got 5,000 answers, which was fun for me as a researcher, because variation is good, but also alarming to me as someone who wants local governments to succeed. How are they ever going to be held accountable? How are they ever going to hold other people accountable if they aren't in agreement on what it is? You'll have 7 people on a governing board all trying to do something different and all thinking they're doing it for a good reason, because who could be against accountability? There's other areas where there needs to be alignment as well, but the bottom line is it's another one of those foundational elements for a small group that's in a governing process. Do we all agree on what our key terms actually mean and what our key goals are? Because if we don't, we're just talking past each other, guarantees a bad outcome. So in the report, I have I should say we, because it's me, Renee, and Beth who wrote this thing. We have some very practical advice for what governing boards can do when they get sick. That's my scary air quotes there. And some of the most common ways a governing board gets off track is role confusion. They don't know who's in charge of what. You see this a lot in the city manager form of government, where you have council members who think all the department heads work for them, and they're not working through the city manager. People aren't understanding their roles. It creates confusion. It's that office space situation, right? I have 7 bosses, so how could I, no matter what I do, I'm doing something wrong. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. We talked about the different conflict types, but then we also have groupthink. And this occurs when you have a governing board that really, is afraid to disagree with one another, and they start self-censoring and not speaking their mind, and they don't allow differing opinions to enter into the conversation. That's also a problem. And then there's the obvious things where we just don't trust one another. And you'll note I have some solutions in there, but I'm gonna pivot here to the actual governing toolkit because we got about 20 minutes till we're going to turn it over to questions, and I want to walk through that. But I do want to bring up that I recently took my children to go see Hamilton, so that's why dueling seemed like a realistic way to deal with relationship conflict until I saw the end of that play. Then I realized that was a bad way to go. So the broad takeaway here is that democratic governance relies on the ability of individuals to work cohesively as a group in pursuit of these high-level goals. And the tools that I'm about to walk through, even though some of them are geared toward the individual, it's important to point out that it's meant to create a culture on the governing board as a whole. One of the constants in any type of governing board is change, personnel turnover. And there's always going to be the possibility that there's one or two individuals on a governing board that are still learning or that don't buy into something. So it's not, there's no naivety here that a governing board as a whole is going to adopt this. But the idea is over time, if you can have a governing board where a majority serving on there buy into some of these steps to improve their culture, they become the safeguards against some of these pathologies of governance, some of these negative things that can occur. And the hope is that it is that culture that builds over time, that can be established, that can continue even as turnover occurs. So I'm going to end this show and then bring on a PDF. So you're going to see me stop sharing here for a second. And look at that. I see all your lovely faces. Nobody's blinking because you're all screens. So hang on. I'm going to pull up a different PDF here. Share my screen. Thank you for your patience as always. All right. Can everybody see this?
We can see it, Mike.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and try to make it screen view too. And I'm going to ask for more reassurance that you can see this. Can you still see this, Dr. Larson?
I can still see it, but it is still the same format. It hasn't transitioned for me yet to screen view.
That's no good. Still nowhere. Still not working.
Still same. Yeah, same screen still.
Well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make it work anyways. Hang on a second. All right. Big enough to see though?
Yep.
All right. So this is the governing toolkit, and we'll post this online when it's released later this month. And happy to share this stuff with you. We're also going to post this is in Word format, not just PDF, because the idea is that governing boards can actually use these things, these various policies, adopt them and edit them and personalize them for their own governing board. And you'll see I got a bunch of tools here, but I'm going to walk through them one by one, and you'll see the logical progression here is starting off with what are the materials you can give to someone new that's serving on a governing board. Anytime there's a turnover, so after an election or after a new cycle of appointments, to establish that foundation so people know what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then some tools on how to intervene when things aren't going so well. So the first thing is having a sample board member job description. And I think this is important, and this can be tailored to your form of government and to your type of governing board, be it public or nonprofit. But the idea here is that if you look at state statutes and some of the descriptions about, what does a city council member do? What does a town board member do? It's really, really vague and open-ended. So I think there's value to having a sample job description, something that everyone can buy into, be exposed to, and certainly you can modify this to fit your own governing needs, but it sets a baseline. And when people really get outside the box and are going against their agreed upon job duties, it's a document that a majority of the board can use as an accountability mechanism as well. So it should inform somebody, but also have value after the fact. And I won't read this all to you, but you'll see that the basic idea here is to lay out What are the roles and responsibilities? And what are the preferred qualifications? And the qualifications is kind of interesting because I always say this to my undergrad students. I'm like, you know, the qualification for holding public office, one more vote than the other person. So, right, what do you mean qualifications, Mike? Well, maybe expectations is a better way of putting this. So, you know, being committed to attending, embracing certain ideals of democratic governance and transparency, civility, honesty, support for final council board decisions, setting out an expectation of when you should be recusing yourself, and what is ethical and what is not ethical. And I'm not naive enough. Like I said, I've served as an elected official for 3 years. I'm not naive enough to think that if we just write it down as a board responsibility, or as a job description, everyone's going to follow it to a T. No, I mean, this is meant to be a living, breathing document, but it can be a discussion at those times of turnover where you can get people at the baseline to commit to something. I think it can also be useful as a recruitment mechanism for individuals that might be interested in serving on a governing board. Here's what we expect you to do. Here's what this actually looks like. And like I said, this will be available as a Word document so you can edit it. But shout out to Renee Christensen, who did a really good job looking for some of the job descriptions that are out there, and then helping me and Beth create this document. The next foundational tool we have here is this governance versus operations fact sheet. And this is a big one. And if you know anything about the UW Oshkosh Masters of Public Admin program, we really have a lot of students and a lot of graduates that are working in professionally managed cities. And by far, the number one complaint I get from city managers and village administrators when they start is, you know, my governing board they're getting involved in operations. And my answer, my reaction to that is always, well, do they know, right? Has this ever been laid out for them, you know, what their role is? Because when there's role confusion and role ambiguity, that can lead to confusion and governance failure. So this is just a real simple one-page document that looks at some of the big differences between governance and operations. You know, governance being high-level oversight, so setting goals, figuring out the scope of services to be provided, creating programming, approving budgets, creating policies, all the things that are these high-level things that we want governing boards who have a broader connection to the community and serve as that voice, that bridge between community values and desires and actual service delivery, the things we want them to be focused on. And then we have operations here. And this is more provided, not, right, if you're working in operations, you probably understand what operations are and aren't. But I think it's nice to give examples to a governing board member to know the kind of things they shouldn't be involved in, right? Hiring and firing staff. I always want to just, you know, shake my head during campaign season when you have people running for office specifically because they want to fire the health director or something. It's like, no, that's not your job. That is not your job. You're not managing day-to-day operations. Right? You're not the one deploying resources across the organization. Yes, you're helping in the budgetary process. You're approving it. You're setting policies, but you're not actually sitting down and developing the budget, and you're certainly not doing implementation. And I think that for some of us, you know, working or that got an MPA and went to school for all this, we're like, well, obviously, of course, this is a no-brainer. But that's not always as clear. I think for public officials that are getting into this for the first time, they may not be aware of that. So it can be really useful to lay that out. And with all of these documents, I think there's huge value, especially for a board that's of elected officials, to actually take a formal vote and commit to these things. It's useful, in my opinion. Some tips to avoid meddling in operations. And this was a list of questions that we came up with after talking to some of our advisory board members, or our MPA alumni board, excuse me, and looking in the research. You know, where are the mistakes that get made when folks do meddle in operations? And it's contacting staff directly and not going through the municipal executive. You know, showing up and doing tours where you're not invited, just showing up at a public building and acting like you're supposed to be there and trying to maybe ask questions, taking people out of their day-to-day work. Don't do that. Speaking on behalf of the entire municipality as one member of a governing board, or speaking on behalf of the entire nonprofit organization as one member of the nonprofit governing board. That is a big no-no. But I think the big thing here is to just know and lay out, who a governing board member should talk to or contact if they have a question about their appropriate role or an appropriate action, and establishing those clear lines of communication. Again, all structural things we can do on the foundational level to, at the very least, make sure that individuals that are starting a term on a governing board are not ignorant to what their appropriate role is and is not. So now let's go to some of the small group dynamics. So moving on from what the expectations are, but trying to focus on those actual deliberations and the ways that you can improve the deliberation process. And this first tool deals specifically with conflict. There's a little preamble there that talks about the importance of a healthy level of conflict, but I already shared that with you. But the real hope here is that this is a tool that can be used by governing boards. It's really fast. It's supported by research, and we're making it available free. So, right, you don't necessarily need to hire some high-powered consultant. I apologize if there's any high-powered consultants on the call. Part of my mission is to show that some of the work they do doesn't need to be as expensive as it is, right? This is something that a governing board in a rural place or a small place without resources, they can take these steps to really identify the measures of perceived conflict on their governing board, and then engage in some thoughtful discussion and organizational development to address it. So this is a little box we created with a bunch of statements, and these statements all correspond with different types of conflict that are present on governing boards, different types of negative conflict. And the idea here is to have every one of your board members individually answer on a scale of 1 to 5. You see this scale up here: 5 strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree. Their level of agreement with these statements as an individual. Then you can average it out as a board. And then you can see what the difference is between your individual answer and the board as a whole. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to fill this out. But where it gets interesting is once you've filled this out, you can really figure out where your governing board colleagues see the conflict that present or not present on their board. And some of the things that we've found in our research are good questions to ask from an organizational development standpoint, depending on your level of conflict. So if you're a really low conflict board, it may just be that you've got a great culture already and you don't want to change things. But sometimes that can be a sign that people aren't engaged, people aren't comfortable voicing their opinions, or sometimes a low conflict board can be a result of an executive who's dominating the governing process. Moderate conflict board, this is where most boards are. And that's where the research shows that you tend to get the best, tend to be the highest functioning and lead to the best organizational outcomes. But it still bears having a discussion here. You can pull out those individual conflict types. Maybe we do really good on everything but relationship conflict. Maybe that's a problem that we can identify, we can measure, we can start to solve. Here too, if you're in this moderate conflict board, you can say that, okay, we know research shows that this is the place where best organizational outcomes are possible. Are we actually getting those outcomes? And if we're not, where are the weak points on those linkages I laid out earlier? Where are those weak points where the message that we're doing a good job sending is not being implemented? Then there's the high conflict board. And this is where you're really at risk for governing paralysis. And a lot of bad things can happen on a high conflict board. One, it can be an embarrassment. Just right, your residents, whoever your stakeholders are, don't trust you. But it also sends, like I said, mixed messages to the municipal executive, can start hurting organizational morale. And I can tell you from an individual who has served and helped placed or taught and helped place many a city manager, it leads to turnover. I don't want to be a city manager on a board that can't get their act together. It's really potentially problematic for the organization. And when we're dealing with public organizations, that's problematic for our residents and our quality of life. The next step in the diagnostic tool for conflict is to look for those outliers and start examining those differences. I mentioned before the importance of perceptions in addition to reality. If you have one member of the board that feels like there's massive conflict and nobody else is there, that also is an important data point because there's some disconnect. People are not aligned. And you can read all this, so I won't belabor the point here because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But the broader point here is that there is a scientifically sound way to measure the level of perceived negative conflict on a governing board, and there's scientifically supported actions that can be taken to mitigate that conflict. But the first step is you have to identify it and you have to set up your systems to track it. So in my perfect world, every governing board would do this anytime there's turnover. So whether that's annually, every 2 years, but anytime you're bringing new people on, let's do a little, let's take 20 minutes to give ourselves a little bit of a self-diagnosis about what's working, what's not working in terms of conflict. The next tool, the regenerative relationships tool, it's very similar, but here we're looking at those statements that correspond with trust and ownership. So whereas the conflict tool is getting at what is your overall level of negative conflict, generally a bad thing, this is measuring the good stuff. Do we have a culture on our governing board that promotes trust and ownership? And what's great about, I think, the regenerative relations concept is that if you're doing a good job on this, it means your board's getting stronger every time you interact with one another. And you know what? If you have a governing board that gets better at its job every time it interacts, that's a governing board people want to be a part of. That's a governing board people want to serve and want to interact with. I think it can be an incredibly powerful thing. Same deal, we have this list of statements. You give your answer, average out the board, figure out the differences, then have a discussion. Identify your board. Do your board members feel you're a low trust board, a medium trust board, or a high trust board? And just like the conflict tool, there's a list of questions that you can ask yourself during an organizational development process that can help, identify where we have our weaknesses, where there isn't trust, the cause of that, and more importantly, find solutions, things that we can do about it. Once again, none of this is a guarantee of success, but not doing it, in my experience, is a guarantee of failure because you're not setting the foundation that makes success possible. You'll see here, I also have real clear steps to discuss those outliers, see if there's one item that people are doing particularly good or bad on, and then the suggestion to track progress over time. So every year or every time there's board turnover, you can see where you're at and hopefully identify potential signs of a problem before they manifest in actual governance failures that translate into organizational failures. I'll be real quick because I got 2 minutes here where we have our 15 minutes of questioning, but there's some other tools in here as well that are a little less interactive, but nonetheless just as important. We have some sample governing alignment statements. So statements that a governing board can adopt to really put in stone what the agreed upon definition of these key concepts are. So we have a sample accountability statement. We have a sample statement dealing with commitment to strategic planning, and a sample statement laying out a commitment to nonpartisanship. The idea is not for a municipality or a governing board in a different context to just take these and adopt them word for word, but to find something that works for them, because it's much more important, and the research shows this, it's much more important that that group of 5 or 7 people is in agreement, or at least a majority is in agreement about what these key concepts mean, as opposed to getting the concept perfectly right. Because bottom line is if you and I both think strategic planning is important, but we can't agree on why it's important, we're talking past one another. We're not getting things done cohesively as a group because we're functioning as 7 individuals or as coalitions, as opposed to a cohesive body of 7 individuals who might have different opinions, but are all committed to that group effort. Last but not least, and I only share this because it has less to do with small group dynamics, but one of the pieces of advice I got from some of our advisory board members was like, what about incompetence? People just don't know what they're doing. I'm like, all right, let's do a cheat sheet here for some really key concepts dealing with performance and dealing with revenues with budgeting, in city councils and village boards. So there's a 1-page cheat sheet there with some resources, and there's a similar one for board members. And then last but not least, there's a simple tool dealing with Robert's Rules of Orders that folks can bring with them to the governing process, so they know how to make a motion, what's appropriate, what requires a vote, etc. So it's 12:45. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm hoping we can open it up to some questions or comments. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just reiterate, folks, if you want to either type in the chat or if you want to turn on your video, turn on your mic, join the conversation, we are more than open to that.
Yeah, please do. And I just see from this group, we have a lot of folks that are living this stuff day to day. So feel free to set us straight too if we're way off base.
Mike, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So on the other side of the coin, more or less, is what if a staff member is tasked with, chairing not chairing, but staffing the committee? They're the sole city employee staffing the committee, say a plan commission.
Yep.
And the commission tends to look at the full-time staffer as the one that is in charge of the dynamics or running an efficient plan commission meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? That's, you're right. We were very focused on governing board specifically, but I think there is a need for tools for that staff member as well. You're right. I think we take it for granted that they know what they're doing or they're getting the right advice, but they might not. Yeah, so that's not a great answer for you, but I'm glad you brought it up because that is some place where we can fill in some gaps.
Oftentimes staff feels that, yeah, they're in charge of the agenda, the material getting out and picking off all the items, but
yeah,
generally I think it's a passive role, and I think the commissioners look at full-time staff as the leader. So there's a kind of a conflict there.
And there's certainly a skill set that those individuals who are the staff liaisons, when they do possess it, they're able to deal with difficult situations that do occur on governing boards. So you're right, they need to be educated on this stuff too. So you gave us a new report here. I like it. Thank you.
Although this was timely, I'm introducing a new plan commission member later today, so this is timely. I can give him this PowerPoint.
Excellent, excellent.
Material.
I love to hear that.
Related to that, I'll just mention in the chat, Doug had asked if there's a link to the resources and tools shared today. And so, Mike, I guess I'll pass that to you. What are your thoughts on when the material will be available to folks?
Yeah, I was thinking within the next week, but I don't see why we can't post that. We have everybody's email here, right? We can certainly email that out to everybody, the toolkit and the report, even in draft format and in Word format, so you can start using it right away. And in fact, humble brag here, but I got contacted 2 days ago from the New York School Board Association, and they were using some other stuff we had done, and they're already in possession of this and using it in their training, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, so yeah, we can for sure then follow up, share the PowerPoint and the toolkit, at least in draft form. And then when it's final, you may see another email from us just letting you know where you can access that. And we post all of our research products on our website, so it should always be available once we put the official document out there.
Yeah, it's only $40. No, it's free. I'm kidding. It's all free. Everything we do is available to everybody for free.
Other questions, feel free to jump in. Like I said, either unmute yourself or in the chat.
It was just so on point, I guess. I do want to reiterate, because I've been running through this with folks that I've worked with in different capacities. And in one of the questions that really kept me up at night was thinking about, like, someone saying, will people be insulted if they're giving materials like this, or will they not buy into it? And I alluded to this earlier, and my response is that you don't need everybody to buy into it completely. It's about creating a culture where it's expected that we're going to be tracking this stuff, we're going to be measuring this stuff, we're going to be committed to this stuff during the onboarding process. And doesn't mean that there won't be conflict, doesn't mean there won't be destructive conflict at times. But if you can build that culture where there's a critical mass of individuals involved in the governing process that do buy into it, they start to police themselves. And it becomes really uncomfortable for that 1 or 2 or 3 board members or that small coalition to behave in ways that go against the positive culture you're trying to develop.
Hey, Mike.
Yes, Russ.
I think you have a real good toolkit. I think it's really great. I know from a practical standpoint, when I was the chief executive officer for my organization, we would always have kind of in-service training day for newly elected officials. We didn't necessarily follow your toolkit, and I wish we would have, but we also did, made other departments and other department activities available. And we actually did like tours and showed them how the process and operations work. So they had a kind of a basic understanding of the municipal operations side of things. And so I think it's always a great idea if you can set up some type of kind of in-service or, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, or 4 hours training for newly elected officials, because you're right, most of the times they come on board and they are not real well prepared on what their role really is. And I think this is helpful.
100%. And I say that, Russ, in all seriousness, as a client, I'm supposedly I teach public administration. I'm learning new stuff every day, serving on a governing board like that.
Mike, can I just jump in on that? And I hope that I'm not overstating, but maybe just so folks know, I think that when we, many months ago, when we started talking about this project and when you started talking about this project, just to Russ's point, I think that we discussed kind of taking this show on the road and going to folks and being able to do some capacity building and some training around this. And so I think that I just want to throw that out there, that if folks are interested, feel free to reach out to us. We, as I mentioned, we're a newborn, almost a newborn. We're 1 year in the making as the Whitburn Center, but the great thing about it is we're really focused on being responsive to folks and their needs. And so just because we haven't done something before doesn't mean we can't do that. So if anyone would be interested in something like that, feel free to reach out to Mike or myself.
Yes, please. And we'll be doing a mailing to every municipality in Wisconsin that they'll get this stuff. But yes, we would love to come. Would love to come talk to your governing boards as well. Help out.
Yeah. And I'll just also follow up in the chat from Chris. Chris said, see a lot of newer board members that do not understand their roles. So, right, seeing a need there. And then Kathy has a question for you, Mike, and asked, have you looked at social media and the role it plays in governance? Social media can be disruptive if elected officials fail to engage in public meetings in a meaningful way, but then go outside the meeting and begin to express their views that have not been discussed publicly as a governance board. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, I'll say that because somewhat of a short answer. I mean, that is a classic example of what we talk about, the regenerative relationships idea. I mean, that's when you get low scores, when there's not trust or ownership over a decision. So a governing board makes a decision, everyone goes home and posts on Facebook how they hate it. Right? I didn't vote for it, so don't blame me. Right? That's people not taking ownership over a decision. And as you said, Kathy, as your question alludes to, in the area of social media, it's really easy for folks, even maybe if they don't think before they do it. They can get a really large audience for it. And frankly, that's how a lot of people end up getting into these positions in the first place, is they build a following on social media. So to answer your question, no, we have not looked at that specifically. I think we're dealing with some of the symptoms of that, but I think you bring up a good point that there is value for us to find a way to engage in that, and maybe even a social media policy suggestions that governing boards might want to adopt, because yeah, that can be incredibly disruptive. Very good question.
Hey, Dr. Larson and Dr. Ford, one suggestion, again, from my practical experience, trying to reach out to individual communities might be a pretty overwhelming thing, but I do know from experience, and I've actually kind of taught some budgeting things. The League of Wisconsin Municipalities has a workshop for newly elected leaders, and they have like a series of 5 or 6 workshops around the state. And something like the toolkit could be a good part of that. And I don't know if you want to reach out to the league, I think they might be a good partner at least present this toolkit to that during that regional gatherings.
Agreed. And yeah, we definitely, I mean, we've collaborated with them on a couple things, and this is certainly something where I'll take that suggestion for sure, reach out to them. Because yeah, I mean, that'd be a great way to get at a critical mass of people too, instead of going, like you said, individually, one-on-one places. Looking at Kevin's comment here, and yes, I agree, right? I should have prefaced this. Right, we're starting out with what the ideal situation is, recognizing the fact that some things are not going to be realistic, and that's why it's important that we put these documents out there in in a format that can be edited, and can actually be adopted and tailored to what boards actually need and what is realistic. Because you're right, there could be, Kevin, to your point, maybe not just realistic, but I've had this interaction with my own city manager where there's certain issues where he'll just say, okay, you can reach out directly. I'll run it by him. But right, from a management standpoint, there's just not time for it. So you're right. I think we could go a little more in depth there, and we'll have to visit that. So thank you for sharing that.
A tool we use in that venue is we don't just do onboarding for new elected officials, but we do 2 work sessions a year with all of our elected officials. And we kind of treat it like, we call it a strategic planning session, but a lot of it ends up being, it's just a recalibration of the interactions with the elected officials and how they interact with staff. And I go so far as to come right out and tell them, just remember that no individual elected official has any oversight over any employee. You only have oversight in mass as a group. And I say it and I repeat it and do it in a nice way, in a constructive way. But we do that. And this last time we actually went so far as to now we're bringing in chairs of our various boards, committees, and commissions to kind of calibrate their roles and the expectations and what we're looking for from them. And it's worked really well. We've been doing this for 2 years, and 2.5 years ago, I had the worst board I've worked with in nearly 20 years of doing this. And now I call it the best board, and it doesn't always agree. And some of it is not just these training sessions. We've had some change in who is on the board, for full disclosure, but it's been very well. And it gives those elected officials too, even if they're not new, the chance to say, okay, you keep saying TIF, tell me again what TIF is, or, and they can do it in a venue where it's not at an official city council meeting, where then they're embarrassed that, they're sitting around the decision-making table and they don't know the answer to something. So, been very happy in doing that. And we started once a year, and the elected officials actually asked to do it twice a year.
That's so cool, Randy. That's great that they're willing to do that and buy into it. I mean, that's awesome. And that gets at, I know we're almost done here, but that really gets at the heart of why we started the Whitburn Center, why we're drawn to this, that we want to focus on things that are practical, that can actually be done. It doesn't require some massive policy change. These are things that you can do as a governing group today. Ooh, good suggestion there, Chris.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that, Chris. And yeah, just to be mindful of everyone's time, I think I want to wrap us up for today. But again, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, anything you all need, feel free to reach out to Mike or myself. Mike, do you mind just throwing your email in the chat there for folks if
Absolutely.
They don't have it? And just so you all know, so Whitburn Wednesdays, this is a monthly event. So the second Wednesday of every month, and we will be doing them this year over the lunch hour from 12 to 1. Our next event is October 12th, and it will be featuring Chris Estrella, who's a graduate of our MPA program. He's serving as a Whitburn Fellow this year with the Whitburn Center, and Chris worked for over 16 years as a clerk, treasurer in Wisconsin. He served on the Wisconsin Municipal Clerks Association board from 2012 to 2016, served as president in 2016, 2017. And he's now transitioned to a role where he's working for HeyGov, which focuses on strategies to digitally transform local government operations. So he's going to be talking in October about ways to go paperless, amongst other things, for local government folks. So watch your email. You'll probably be hearing from us about that. And we're just thankful again that you all joined us for our first event, and please reach out anytime.